Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your test. A full textbook, tons of questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off. Now, let's get started. So today we've got Jayson Weingarten on the show. Jayson, I'd love if you could introduce yourself and your company to us.
Sure, Tyler. It's great to be back. I'm Jayson Weingarten from Ivy Coach. We are a premier boutique college admissions consultancy. We've been around since the mid-90s, helping students and their families earn admission to our nation's most highly selective schools. We have a lot of success and a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, great. And so today we're going to be talking about the biggest lies in college admissions that are things that I guess you hear maybe your clients say when they first walk in the door, or kind of where do these come from?
Exactly. So college admissions is one of those topics when I go to a dinner party or I'm somewhere and I say what I do, always gets questions. Oh, did you know about this? How about that? Hey, I heard something or other. Or my neighbor was saying this. Oh, I was at the grocery store. I think that there's so much intrigue about what happens in the admissions office that people will fill the intrigue with explanations. And some of these explanations are just not based in fact. Some of these explanations are based in wishful thinking. Some of these explanations are based on what someone thought happened based on hearsay, especially for us when we're working with our families. When students and their families first come to us, we offer a 1-hour strategy session to really set a plan in motion for a student. And a lot of what we hear during that session is, oh, I never knew that, or, oh, that I thought the opposite. It's amazing. I don't even want to use the words misinformation or disinformation. It's amazing just like how many lies and untruths there are in college admissions. And it makes sense just based on the intrigue and the kind of mystery that seems to still wrap around college admissions.
Well, right. And I mean, some of these lies are things that people have been told, maybe even by people in your profession, right? For whatever reason. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously they're coming at, like, the parents are coming at it going, oh my God, like this expert told me these things. And it's just, they're trying to sell you something probably.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to debunk these. Let's start with number
That's
one.
right.
What do you think is kind of the first big lie here?
So especially, today, this year, that we're, coming out of the shadow of the pandemic when so many colleges went test optional, they went test flexible, when they went no tests, whatever marketing PR spin they put. There's still this thought that top schools don't care about the tests anymore. When colleges got rid of the tests in 2020, 2021, it was predominantly because these tests were just not being offered amid a global pandemic. And these colleges that care deeply about their rankings in the US News World Report and Forbes, all the other rankings that come out year in and year out, they did not want to see a drop in the number of students who applied, because that would not help the school in the rankings. And if you are a student and you think that you need to submit SAT scores to the likes of Harvard and Yale, and you were unable to take the test because there's a global pandemic going around, then you would say, well, I guess I should not apply. I guess I'm not getting in. So colleges, they dropped the test requirement largely to keep their application numbers high. The
Right.
fact is that many schools are bringing back the SAT or the ACT as an expectation, as a requirement. They're using a lot of marketing and PR to explain why they're, quote unquote, bringing the requirement back. But the few schools, I'd point to Cornell, Georgetown especially, that have that did show their stats for students who did and did not submit scores clearly
Mhm.
show that the students who do submit test scores earn admission at higher rates than students who do not submit test scores. Looking a few years down the line, the freshman GPAs have been shown for students that do submit test scores to be nearly a point higher than the students who did not submit test scores to the
Right.
same university. Colleges, admissions officers, they care about these tests. And so if you have a good score, you should be submitting your good score. Going
Mhm.
test optional doesn't mean that they don't care about the scores. It's more a reflection that they care about those rankings.
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things to unpack here. The first thing is like the thing you're alluding to is basically like this idea that um, people who did not submit test scores have actually been proven to be less prepared for the universities that they got into than those who did, right? That's really
Mm-hmm.
the biggest thing that is going to drive change in administrators' behavior. When the University of Texas Austin released that information, like you said, that showed that their test optional students, their SAT scores were an average of 200 points lower, and then they had a grade point average freshman year that was almost a point lower. That is something that is going to affect test optional for them and for everyone else, because those give you kind of a benchmark of like, okay, well, if I admit someone without test scores, you know, realistically, we can expect that their scores were lower than the people who did submit them, right? Because if they were higher, they would
Mm-hmm.
have submitted them. And so that means we can make assumptions about this person, right? And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, those assumptions should not be based on anything else other than the test scores, or lack thereof. But it is still something that is going to be on their mind when they're looking at your application. And I think it just puts you in a worse position than if you submit scores, even if the scores you submit are like average or maybe even like a little bit below average. I think if you're significantly below average, but your heart is set on applying to a certain school, maybe you do test optional, but you should assume that they know that, right? It's kind of like by omitting your test scores, you're kind of telling them all they need to know.
I definitely agree with that. And it's not even an assumption. College admissions is not like the American criminal justice system where you are innocent until proven guilty.
Hmm.
College admissions at highly selective schools that have single digit and low teen acceptance scores, the presumption is you are being rejected
Hmm.
because that's what it means to be a highly selective school. They're going to reject 9 out of 10 students and they're going to admit, fewer than 1 out of 10 students. And so they have to assume that you're not going to be admitted. And if you are not sending them the data points, the reasons to be admitted, like a good SAT score, good ACT score, then you're not helping the admissions officer root for you. And
Hmm.
so they don't even need to assume, which would likely be a correct assumption, that the reason that you didn't submit a score is because you don't have a good score to submit. They're just going to say, well, what else? There's nothing here. We don't have enough information to make the decision to admit a student. Colleges, these admissions officers, they're very risk averse. They don't want to be taking a risk. And
Hmm.
when you present less information or bad information, you become a risk.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And also it's I think, you've seen already that the very top schools, like Harvard, Dartmouth, I think Yale and MIT, they've all gone back to requiring test scores, and it feels like, they kind of set the mood and the tone for the rest of the industry. So I
Mm-hmm.
can foresee this being something that, I mean, essentially, so there are going to be some schools that go back to requiring test scores. That's already starting to happen. There will also probably be a lot of schools that will always keep test optional officially, but in practice use it pretty sparingly, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
then this goes back to kind of like the why are people getting lied to part of the conversation. the schools are telling you, oh, it's test optional because they want you to apply because that's good for them, right? It makes it
Yep.
so that their acceptance rate is lower and, probably somebody in the admissions office gets a raise versus if they're actually giving you somewhat bad advice because they have an incentive for you to apply when in reality
Hmm.
your chances when you apply test optional may not be really worth your time.
That's
um,
right. I mean, there's
yeah,
there's a big logical leap from going that the school is test optional, which is true, to therefore the school does not care about the SAT scores, which
right.
is false. And so many people think, and the lie is that schools don't care about these test scores anymore. That is not true.
It's not true, and it's also it's misleading you in the wrong way, right?
Hmm.
It's leading you into a bad decision, which is pretty unfortunate. But yeah,
That's right.
that's a good one. I think that's an important one. I feel like we kind of hit that one and and have it pretty well covered, but I think it was important, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Hmm.
So what
Hmm.
is the second most common lie in college admissions right now?
So you hear this a lot from parents who maybe were applying or going to school in the 80s or the 90s, that they think that a student needs to be well-rounded. That
Yeah, yeah.
their student needs to be playing a sport and playing an instrument and doing service and being in 3 clubs and doing this and doing that. And at the end of the day, colleges are increasingly not looking for well-rounded students. They really haven't been looking for well-rounded students in a decade. Colleges want to enroll a well-rounded class, right? They need some students interested in the life sciences and some students interested in the social sciences and some students interested in the humanities. They need someone to be able to kick a field goal from 50 yards out. They need someone to be able to hit 90% from the free throw line. They need someone to, be a social justice, person in the town and gown, relationship. But these are all very different types of students. Colleges are looking for the well-lopsided student,
Mm.
students who are excelling, that are focused, that are impactful in a specific field. Maybe that field is an athletic field. If you are a recruited athlete, it would be very, very rare for you also to be an award-winning scholar. If you
Right.
are an award-winning scholar, it would be very rare for you to be an award-winning scholar in multiple different areas. And so being well lopsided is definitely going to help an applicant stand out much more than trying to be involved in do a little bit of everything.
And it's also, I mean, it's a reflection of the change in kind of what the system wants when you get out, right? Like I think the whole kind of
Hmm.
well-rounded thing, I don't know where that came from actually, but I think, it was well-intentioned, right? It was like people should have lots of different experiences and things like that. But now as we've
Hmm.
gotten into, the information age with computers and the fact that, you know, essentially um, you there's a lot more opportunity for specialization a lot sooner. There's a lot more specialization to be had in sort of our modern economy, right?
Hmm.
And there's also just like not that much overlap between things anymore, right? Like, I think there was an argument back in the day that if you were going into business, it would also be useful for you to have done some theater because you learn about like, basically like putting on a face and like persuading people and things like that. Now
Hmm.
it's just like, okay, there's finance, right, where you don't talk to people at all, right? There's sales where you only talk to people, right? And so you can
Hmm.
just train for those things. Like you don't necessarily enter your career now as open-ended as you used to. Usually you've got a lot of it figured out ahead of time
Yep.
because even if you're a fresh college grad, a employer still wants to see that you've like had some internships in the field that you want to be doing and that your major is related to the field that you want to be doing and maybe you're in a club that was related to
Yeah.
the field you want to be doing and there isn't time for you to participate in all 200 clubs that right like you
No.
you have to specialize.
And, we're fortunate that now, there are those 200 clubs, right? I mean, high school, if you compare the list of extracurricular opportunities at a high school today versus in a parent's generation, there's a lot more options today. There's a lot more options that are, a second level deep. It's not like everyone who's interested in science is doing just the science Olympiad. If you are interested in science, you might be doing you might be doing a robotics. You might be doing a computer science. You might be doing all these different things that didn't even exist a generation ago. And so, we're fortunate that we have an increasing amount of opportunities that speak to the diversity of interests that students can have. And so the, kind of picture from the 1980s movie of that well-rounded, jack of all trades, big man on campus, that is, that's from an era gone by.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an era gone by, and I mean, it's also just like you said, it's kind of bad advice now, right? Like a
Hmm.
student, a student that, at least in my mind, and I'm not a college counselor, but like I feel like a student that spends all of their time on like a nonprofit or like other kind of project, like making an app that actually has a real impact on either their community or the world at large, and that's the one thing that they do, almost has a better chance of getting into a top school than somebody who is in choir and also on the track team and also, president of
Yep.
the book club or whatever. Like, I think it's just instead of, oh, like I'm kind of a general overachiever, it's like you can tell a whole story about that one project that you did and like,
Hmm.
make it the focus of your essays. And it's also very unique and kind of helps you stand out. Like I just think that that is the the much better way to orient your strategy nowadays.
Oh, definitely. And beyond the kind of, metrics that you might be able to have of, how many people you impacted or how well you achieved or anything like that, it just also shows good personal qualities and kind of the soft skills that, this is a mature student who knows what they like and knows what they're good at and knows what they want to do. And colleges take that and look favorably at that. They know that, okay, this student likely is going to need a lot less academic advising than a peer that, has no idea what they want to do and is undecided and is just, not as pointed as a peer.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Well, great. Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Let's go on to the third one. So, what's the third big lie right now?
So the third is that you need to do a lot of service, that you need to do community service, that there's a magic threshold number of hours, that, it's imperative to demonstrate commitment through your community, through doing a lot of nonprofit volunteering and all of this. I'm not going to say anything bad about service to community. God knows there is a lot of help that is needed in our world, a lot of different people and a lot of different causes that are all, have incredible merit and are deserving of time and attention. But for a application to a
Mhm.
top school, you do not need to be listing any community service. If you are doing so many things that are just not service, you don't need to be worried that, oh, but I don't have, any community service of my 10 activities I list in the Common App. We have had plenty of students who don't put any community service, nonprofit, volunteer, anything in their application, and they earn admission. There's also students that don't put a sport and they still earn admission. There's students that don't put anything musical or artistic in their application and they still earn. Community service is another type of, extracurricular that a student may pursue alongside a work or an internship, an in-school club, a community organization. But it's not an end-all be-all, and there's no reason to think that service is inherently better than any of the other types of opportunities, or at the same time, that any specific cause is better than
Mhm.
any other type. For some students, yes, doing service for a specific cause that relates to how they are well lopsided is going to be good and is something that they should pursue and is going to be additive to their application. But there's not a one-size-fits-all that everyone needs to be feeding the homeless or everyone needs to be calling bingo for 100 games at the senior center. That is just not a thing.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was getting at a little bit with the last one that we were talking about, which is that what you really kind of should be working towards now, at least in my opinion, is like some kind of story or, personal
Hmm.
mission or what like vision for your future career or your life. And activities that are related to that and basically build upon or strengthen or are the foundation of that story are a lot more impactful than whatever else you're doing, right? So if
Hmm.
you're really, really focused on robotics and that's your whole thing, you don't also need to chip in some athletics and chip in some community service just to because you feel like you have to check the box.
That's right. It's the box checking exercises of thinking, oh, I need to do service or I need to that's very in line, as you say, with the kind of feeling that you need to be well rounded, and that is not the path to go down.
Yeah. Well, great. Then let's talk about the next one. What's number four?
So the fourth one is that the personal statement is the most important essay. So on the Common App, we're talking about the 650 word essay, choosing one of the half dozen different essay topics. Some schools that have their own application systems, Georgetown will have their own version of the personal statement. The UC system, they'll have the 4 personal insight questions. But the idea that the personal statement is like the most important essay is not a good perspective to take. Yes, the personal statement is important. It's nearly a requirement for all of the top schools and universities that are out there, but it's not more important than the questions that they will ask on their supplementary materials. When
Mhm.
they are asking questions, especially the why us question, why are you applying to X university? Talk about your interests in X major that you've selected and how you imagine pursuing it at our university. Those are just as important. I'd even argue maybe even more important than the personal statement. It's
Mhm.
amazing how students will spend hours and hours and hours just crafting the most just manicured personal statement,
Mhm.
like it's an amazingly perfect lawn in the front of their house that is uniform and green and lush and oh, it's so beautiful. And then they'll just spend a few minutes on the supplementary essays and it'll be like a wreck in the backyard, a giant rock pile.
Right.
Students really need to be spending time on those supplementary essays, as much or more than the personal statement. Because if a school is going out of the way to ask a question, you can be assured that they're going to go out of their way to understand your answer.
Mhm. Well, and particularly if you've got this perfect personal statement and then your other essays are not very good, like it's kind of like pictures in a dating profile. People are always going to judge you on the worst one. And the, if you've got like this big disparity between your essays, they're at best going to think that you just didn't put very much time into the other ones. And at worst, they're going to think that you got help with the personal statement, right? Um,
Oh, definitely.
and certainly, it shows it like basically offers a little bit of a window into the applicant's process and thinking, right? Where it's like, okay, so this applicant is going to do a nice job on things they think are important, but they won't do a nice job on things that they don't think are important, right? That's like information that could be inferred from that. And then also at the end of the day, I mean, I hate to say that all essays are important, but that's probably the closest thing to the truth. You never know which
Hmm.
essay is going to be the one that really catches the reader's eye and makes them think about you as, a special candidate.
Oh, definitely. And, not every essay question that is asked through the entirety of an application is going to be a place where a student is maybe best equipped to answer the question and, quote unquote, win a few points. Sometimes you're going to get a question and you're not going to know how to answer it. And at that point, you might feel like you need to, do no harm rather than kind of go for the win. And so there's a wide range of questions that might be asked on a college application. But that being said, all the questions that are being asked need to be answered, need to be attended to, need to be focused on, not just the personal statement.
Right. Yep, exactly. Well, great. And then we have the last one here. What's the last one?
So the last one is that a student's high school guidance counselor knows best. That the counselor that is at the school that maybe you're assigned to because your last name falls in a certain place in the alphabet, that they have the answer. They are looking out for your best interest. They know best. Unfortunately, these guidance counselors in high schools are overworked and underpaid. The
Yeah,
caseloads
they're like
at most public
well-meaning,
schools,
but like how could they possibly do what they're expected to do, right? Which is like handle
oh,
like
of course,
300 or 500 students each or something crazy like that.
that's right. And unfortunately, most are, kind of just turning into, kind of project managers rather than strategic thinkers. They're just
Yeah,
making
yeah,
sure
yeah.
that all of the different boxes are checked and the essays are submitted and the forms go in and the transcripts look good and all of that. Rather than actually sitting down with students and providing that real counseling and that real guidance. And that's a great loss in our society that, there's not really these people anymore in most students' lives when they're going to that large public school. And I'd even say at private schools, where you think that, okay, the private school, they have found like the best of the best in the local area. Maybe they've attracted someone to come from a far off city, and they're providing an amazing, better guidance counselor. I mean, we have found so many times where the guidance counselor at the end of the day is being paid by the school and is
Mhm.
looking out for the best interest of the school. They're looking to make sure that the school is able to say that we have X number of students attending however many top ranked schools, and the guidance counselor is not necessarily looking out for an individual student's best interest. And
Mhm.
so, we definitely do recommend that students, understand whether you're working with, an individual like myself or not, whether you're, seeking specialized advice from an admissions expert or not, that you understand that the guidance counselor at your school is maybe not as familiar with you as you think that they are. They're maybe not as knowledgeable about the latest trends in college admissions as you think they are. They're not necessarily looking out for your best interest as you think they might be.
And they also, I mean, it's like you just said. I just feel like they like what can you control and what can you measure, right? Like it's like you said, it's the project management piece, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
basically like helping people get make sure that the all the application stuff gets done, that they're doing it correctly. And so when you've got when you've got too much work to do and you don't have enough time to do it all, what you do is the stuff that somebody can point a finger at and say, the number of kids who applied to college went down last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what you'll focus on. So it's not that the college counselors at these schools don't care, right? In fact, they probably would love to spend a lot more time on students. But at the end of the day, they don't have the ability or the environment or whatever you want to call it to like give the proper care to each student
Mm-hmm.
that asks for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that also, like what it leads to, like you said, is that there's no consultative approach. It's just kind of a generic, like, all right, like here, these are your grades, like these are your SAT scores, here's a recommendation list, knock yourself out, good luck, make sure to check all the
Mm-hmm.
boxes, right? Like there's no like, hey, like given your, really deep interest in this topic, like I think you should look for these specific schools that like are really focused in this area and make sure you write your essay about it, right? All the things that are the best things to do require time from the consultant or the, in this case, the counselor to even unearth those things, right? And then be able to
Yeah.
deploy them and successfully like include them in the application later.
Yeah. I mean, and at the end of the day, are there great high school guidance counselors that are out there? Of course. Are there, wonderful heartwarming stories of a special relationship between a high school guidance counselor and a student where, years later, the student's at the grocery store back for Thanksgiving and there's like a run in and they reconnect and they remember and this guidance counselor changed the life of the student? Of course. Unfortunately, though, things like that have become the exception and not the rule. And I wish that was not the case, but unfortunately, that's the way society is today. And so students need to understand that, the world that we live in and the reality of the matter, as opposed to the kind of wishful thinking of what utopia we all as wish that society would become.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, it's very much important just to know that that's happening so that you as the parent or the student can kind of just like take everything that you hear from the school guidance counselor with a grain of salt, right? Because at
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day, they're not being like they're not focused on your student. They're just, they've got a ton of other things going on. So even if they're very well meaning and very nice and totally want like what's best for your student, and even if they are at like a private school or some school where like the ratio is a little bit better and they have more time, at the end of the day, they're still kind of looking at this like it's like they're trying to come to a conclusion about something as they drive by it in their car, right? Like looking
Yep.
out the window, like, oh, that looks pretty good. Okay, bye. Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's all that they have time for. And that, yeah, means you should just like take their advice with a grain of salt and always keep your best interests and your goals in mind.
Definitely.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Jayson Weingarten from Ivy Coach. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout.